In 1957, a fire broke out in the graphite core of a nuclear reactor at Windscale in Cumberland. The fire burned for 3 days. It released radioactive contamination across a significant area of northern England and parts of Europe. Milk from farms in the affected area was collected and poured into rivers and the sea for weeks because it was too contaminated to sell. The government suppressed the full accident report for 30 years. In 1983, a pipeline at the Sellafield nuclear reprocessing plant, which had replaced Windscale on the same site, discharged radioactive contamination into the Irish Sea in an incident so significant that Greenpeace filmed it from inflatable boats, and the beach at Seascale was closed. The company paid a fine. The contamination remained. These are not isolated incidents. They are examples of a pattern that runs through the environmental history of the United Kingdom. Industries that poisoned the places where they operated, regulatory responses that were too slow and too weak, cleanup programs that were partial or incomplete, and communities that bore the health consequences of living in contaminated environments without receiving adequate acknowledgement or adequate remediation. In this video, we are counting down 12 places in the UK that were poisoned and never properly cleaned up. Not places where there was an accident and it was dealt with, places where the contamination was documented, where the communities that lived with it were identified, and where the cleanup was either not done, was done inadequately, or is still ongoing and will be ongoing for generations. Stay with me to the end, because number 1 is a place where the contamination is so persistent, so embedded in the environment, and so connected to decisions made by people who are now dead and cannot be held accountable, that the cleanup program is expected to last until the 22nd century. So hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and let's begin. The River Tees and its estuary in northeast England were, for most of the 20th century, the centre of one of the most intensive chemical manufacturing and heavy industrial operations in Britain. ICI, the Imperial Chemical Industries Company, that was for decades one of the largest companies in Britain, operated extensive chemical manufacturing facilities along the Tees from Billingham and Stockton to the estuary at Teesport. The industries that operated on the Tees produced fertilizers, plastics, and a wide range of industrial chemicals. They also produced, across decades of operation, a contamination legacy in the Thames Estuary sediment and in the land adjacent to the former manufacturing sites that environmental surveys have consistently documented as significant. The Thames Estuary sediment contains elevated levels of heavy metals, polychlorinated biphenyls, and other persistent organic pollutants that are a direct legacy of the chemical manufacturing that operated on the river's banks for most of the 20th century. The dredging of the Thames Estuary for navigation, which is periodically necessary to maintain the deep water port facilities at Teesport, disturbs this sediment and releases contamination that has been deposited over decades into the water column. The disposal of contaminated dredge spoil is a regulatory challenge that has been managed with varying degrees of rigor across different dredging operations. The communities of Teesside, who lived adjacent to the ICI facilities, and the other chemical manufacturing operations along the Tees, experienced elevated levels of industrial atmospheric emissions for decades. The specific health consequences for those communities have been the subject of research that has documented associations between industrial emissions and specific health outcomes, without producing the comprehensive independent public health study that the scale and duration of the exposure would appear to warrant. On the south shore of the Firth of Forth in Edinburgh, the former Granton Gasworks site occupies a stretch of waterfront that has been the subject of planning and development proposals for decades. The Granton Gasworks operated from 1904 until the 1980s, producing coal gas and subsequently natural gas storage operations on a site that became one of the most contaminated pieces of urban land in Scotland. The contamination left by the gasworks includes coal tar, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, benzene, heavy metals, and various other substances associated with the production and storage of gas from coal. The gasworks site and the surrounding Granton waterfront have been the subject of extensive planning discussions about regeneration and development. The contamination of the site has been acknowledged in the planning process. The remediation of the contamination has been a condition of development proposals. The specific standard of remediation required, and whether the remediation that has been or will be conducted is sufficient to make the site genuinely safe for residential development, is a question that the planning process has engaged with in the formal technical language of contamination assessment, without consistently translating that assessment into terms that the people who might live on the remediated site could understand and evaluate. The wider Granton waterfront, including the areas adjacent to the former gasworks, has a broader contamination history connected to the various industrial operations that occupied the Forth shoreline in Edinburgh across the industrial period. The development of the Granton waterfront is one of the most significant regeneration projects in Edinburgh. The contamination that the development is being built on is documented in technical reports that most of the future residents of the development will not read. At the mouth of three rivers where they enter the Irish Sea on the Cumbrian coast, the village of Ravenglass sits in an area of outstanding natural beauty. The estuary at Ravenglass, where the rivers Irt, Mite, and Esk converge, is a site of special scientific interest. It is also, according to the Environment Agency's own monitoring data, one of the most radioactively contaminated estuaries in Britain, as a direct result of decades of discharges from the Sellafield nuclear reprocessing plant, approximately 10 miles to the north. Sellafield, which replaced Windscale as the name of the nuclear complex on the Cumbrian coast, has been discharging radioactive material into the Irish Sea since the 1950s. The cumulative discharge of radioactive material from Sellafield into the Irish Sea is, by the measurement of the operators themselves, the highest cumulative discharge from any nuclear installation in the world. The Ravenglass estuary has been the recipient of some of this material, which accumulates in the estuarine sediment and in the animals that live in and around the estuary. The sediment at Ravenglass has shown elevated levels of cesium-137 and technetium-99 and other radioactive isotopes in environmental monitoring conducted over decades. The village of Ravenglass and the estuary around it continue to attract visitors who walk the sand dunes and watch the nesting seabirds and eat in the pub, and are entirely unaware that the sediment beneath the dunes and in the estuary is among the most radioactively contaminated estuarine sediment in Britain. The signs at the estuary describe the wildlife. They do not describe the contamination data. Plymouth Sound is one of the most historically significant bodies of water in Britain. The Royal Navy has used it as an anchorage and operational base for centuries. Drake's Island sits at its entrance. The Mayflower sailed from its shores. The Sound is now a national marine park, the first in England, designated in 2019. It is also the location of documented contamination from the naval and industrial operations that have occupied its shores for centuries, with the most significant recent contamination connected to the Royal Navy's nuclear submarine program and the Naval Base Devonport, the largest naval base in Western Europe. The maintenance and refueling of nuclear submarines at Devonport involves radioactive material. The monitoring of radioactive discharges from Devonport into Plymouth Sound is conducted, and the results are publicly available in the form of technical regulatory reports. The results show that the discharges are within permitted limits. The question of whether the permitted limits are appropriate and whether the cumulative environmental impact of decades of submarine maintenance in a body of water that is now a national marine park has been adequately assessed, is one that the National Marine Park designation has not yet fully engaged with. The Sound also contains historical contamination from non-nuclear sources connected to centuries of naval activity, including heavy metal contamination in the sediment from anti-fouling paints, and from the various industrial processes associated with shipbuilding and maintenance. Plymouth Sound is genuinely beautiful. The National Marine Park designation is genuine. The contamination history is also genuine, and the two have not been fully reconciled in the public presentation of the park. On the Somerset coast near Bridgewater, two decommissioned nuclear power stations Hinkley Point A and Hinkley Point B, sit alongside the construction site of Hinkley Point C, the new nuclear power station currently under construction by EDF Energy. The decommissioning of Hinkley Point A and B involves the management of radioactive material accumulated across decades of nuclear power generation. The Somerset coast around Hinkley Point has been the subject of environmental monitoring for radioactive contamination since the stations began operating. The monitoring data for the coast and the Bristol Channel around Hinkley Point shows the presence of radioactive isotopes in coastal sediment and in marine organisms at levels that are monitored and that regulators characterize as within acceptable limits. The question of what acceptable means in the context of a coastline that now has 3 nuclear facilities at different stages of their operational life, and that is also a stretch of coast used for fishing and recreation, is a question that the regulatory framework addresses with technical precision, and that the public presentation of the Hinkley Point development does not address with equivalent directness. The construction of Hinkley Point C is one of the largest infrastructure projects in Britain. Its promotional materials describe the employment it creates and the low-carbon electricity it will generate. The decommissioning timeline for Hinkley Point A and B, the current state of the radioactive waste management at the site, and the cumulative environmental impact of over 60 years of nuclear operations on the Somerset coast are less prominent in the promotional materials than the jobs and the electricity. And hey, before we reach the final 6, if this video is showing you a United Kingdom whose environmental record is considerably darker than the green and pleasant land of the promotional literature, hit the like button and share it with someone who thinks the British industrial legacy has been adequately addressed, because what follows is the part of this story that is happening right now. Now let's continue. At Skinning Grove in North Yorkshire, where the Cleveland Hills meet the North Sea, the remains of an ironstone mining and ironworks operation that closed in the 1970s have left a contamination legacy in the cliff and beach environment that has been the subject of ongoing management for decades. The ironstone slag that was disposed of on the cliff and beach at Skinning Grove over the decades of the ironworks operation is visible in the cliff face and the beach, where rust-colored material leaches into the sea at the base of the cliffs. The contamination in the Skinning Grove environment is not hidden. It is visible in the color of the cliff and the color of the sea where the leachate enters it. Environmental monitoring has documented the contamination. Management measures have been applied. The management of the contamination is ongoing. What makes Skinning Grove significant in this video is not the scale of the contamination, which is modest compared to some entries on this list, but the visibility. The contamination at Skinning Grove is visible with the naked eye in the color of the rock and the water. It has been visible for 50 years since the ironworks closed. It is being managed. It has not been remediated. The gap between visible contamination and adequate remediation is the gap this video is about. In the South Wales valleys, the legacy of over a century of coal mining includes not just the closed pits and the abandoned communities, but the colliery spoil tips that remain on the hillsides above the valley towns. The Aberfan disaster of 1966, when a colliery tip collapsed onto Pantglass Junior School and killed 116 children and 28 adults, is this channel's most documented account of the specific danger that the tips represented. But Aberfan was not the only unstable or potentially unstable tip in South Wales. Following the Aberfan disaster, a major survey of tips across the South Wales coalfield identified over 100 tips that required attention. The remediation and stabilization of those tips was a major engineering program. It was also an incomplete one. Tips that were considered stable in the 1960s assessments have been re-evaluated in subsequent decades as understanding of the specific conditions that make colliery tips unstable has developed. The extreme rainfall events that climate change is making more frequent in South Wales create conditions that can destabilize tips that have been stable for decades. Post-Aberfan tip stability assessments have been reviewed and updated, but the process of comprehensively assessing and managing every remaining tip in the South Wales valleys is ongoing and not complete. The communities that live beneath the remaining tips on the South Wales hillsides did not choose to live beneath them. The tips were there when the communities were built. The communities grew around the mining industry that produced the tips. The industry is gone. The tips remain. The management of their stability is ongoing. And the community of Aberfan is still there, 58 years after the disaster. At the mouth of the Thames, beneath the waters of the Thames Estuary, lies one of the most significant concentrations of unexploded munitions and chemical weapons in European coastal waters. During and after the Second World War, millions of tons of conventional and chemical munitions were disposed of in British coastal waters. The SS Richard Montgomery, an American Liberty ship that sank in 1944, with a cargo of approximately 1,400 tons of explosives in the Thames Estuary off Sheerness, is the most prominently documented hazard. The Maritime and Coast Guard Agency monitors the wreck. The wreck is fenced. The area around it is restricted. The explosives have been in the water for 80 years. They are still there. The risk assessment for the Richard Montgomery has consistently concluded that the probability of spontaneous detonation is low, but that the consequences of a significant detonation, given the shallow water depth and the proximity to Sheerness, would be severe. But the Richard Montgomery is only the most visible hazard in an estuary that contains a broader munitions disposal legacy. Post-war munitions dumping in the Thames Estuary deposited conventional and chemical weapons in the shallow estuary waters across a period of years after the Second World War. The specific locations, the specific quantities, and the specific types of material deposited in the Thames Estuary through post-war dumping have never been comprehensively mapped to the standard that would allow a full risk assessment of the estuary's munitions legacy. The estuary is used for shipping, for fishing, for recreation, and for the abstraction of water that feeds the treatment plants that supply drinking water to parts of southeast England. In the Northamptonshire town of Corby, a cluster of birth defects affecting children born between 1985 and 1999 to mothers who lived in or near Corby during pregnancy became the subject of the UK's first successful legal case, linking a cluster of birth defects to environmental contamination from industrial activity. Corby had been the site of a major steelworks that operated from the 1930s until its closure in 1980. The cleanup of the steelworks site after closure involved the movement of contaminated soil and materials around the town in lorries that were not covered and that deposited contaminated dust on roads and in residential areas. Children born to women who lived in Corby during the period of the cleanup and who were exposed to the contaminated dust during their pregnancies were found in a cluster study to have significantly elevated rates of limb abnormalities and other birth defects compared to the regional average. In 2009, the High Court found that Corby Borough Council had been negligent in the conduct of the cleanup operations that had exposed pregnant women to contaminated dust. The council was ordered to pay compensation to the affected families. The Corby case established, in the UK legal context, that environmental contamination from industrial cleanup operations had caused birth defects in children born to women who were exposed during pregnancy. The case did not result in criminal prosecution of any council official. The compensation was civil. The families received money. The children who were born with the limb abnormalities and other birth defects connected to the contaminated dust are living with those conditions. On the north shore of the Firth of Forth in Fife, the community of Dalgety Bay has a beach. It also has a documented radioactive contamination problem that has been the subject of monitoring, investigation, and regulation for over 25 years without being resolved. The source of the contamination is the luminous paint used on aircraft instruments at the nearby RAF Donnybristle airfield during and after the Second World War. When the airfield closed, the aircraft were burned, and the debris was used as infill for the coastal development of the Dalgety Bay area. The luminous paint contained radium-226, a radioactive isotope with a half-life of 1,600 years. The radium is in the infill beneath the shoreline at Dalgety Bay. It leaches into the beach as the tidal action gradually erodes the material that contains it. Radioactive particles have been found on the Dalgety Bay beach in numbers that have increased over the monitoring period as the erosion continues. The Ministry of Defence, which is responsible for the contamination as the successor to the RAF operations at Donnybristle, has been in a prolonged dispute with the Scottish Environment Protection Agency about the extent of its responsibility for the cleanup. The dispute has involved formal regulatory notices, legal challenges, and a process of engagement that has continued for over 25 years without producing a completed cleanup. The beach at Dalgety Bay is not closed. It is monitored. Residents and visitors use it. The radioactive particles that have been found on it continue to be found. The radium-226 that is the source of the contamination has a half-life of 1,600 years. The dispute between the MoD and SEPA about who pays for the cleanup has been running for 25 years. The mathematics of these two timescales does not favour the beach. Along the River Tyne in northeast England, the industrial legacy of shipbuilding, chemical manufacturing, and heavy industry has left a contamination profile in the river sediment and the adjacent land that environmental surveys have documented as significant. The Tyne was, for most of the industrial period, one of the most intensively industrialized rivers in Britain. Shipbuilding, armaments manufacturing, chemical production, coking operations, and a range of other heavy industrial processes operated along both banks of the Tyne, from the coast at North and South Shields to Newcastle and beyond. The river received the effluent of all of these operations. The sediment of the Tyne carries the contamination record of the full industrial period. At Wallsend, the site of one of the most famous shipyards in the world, Swan Hunter, which built vessels including the Carpathia that rescued survivors of the Titanic, the industrial legacy includes former tar works and chemical manufacturing operations, whose contamination has been documented in environmental surveys. The redevelopment of former industrial sites along the Tyne, including parts of the former Swan Hunter Yard, has involved contamination assessment and varying degrees of remediation. The contamination in the Tyne sediment itself, which is not a site that can be straightforwardly remediated in the way that land sites can, is managed rather than addressed. Dredging operations that disturb the contaminated sediment are regulated. The contamination in the sediment that is not disturbed remains. The Tyne is now much cleaner than it was at the height of the industrial period. Salmon have returned to the river. The contamination that accumulated across a century of industrial use is not gone. It is in the sediment. It is managed. The salmon swim above it, and now we have reached number 1. The site at Sellafield in Cumbria, which was called Windscale before the 1957 fire made that name a liability, is the most contaminated nuclear site in the United Kingdom and one of the most contaminated in the world. It has been the centre of British nuclear operations since the late 1940s. It produced the plutonium for Britain's nuclear weapons programme. It processed nuclear fuel from power stations across Britain. It discharged radioactive material into the Irish Sea in quantities that have made the Irish Sea the most radioactively contaminated sea in the world by the measure of authorized discharges from a nuclear installation. And now it is being cleaned up. The Sellafield cleanup is managed by the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority, a government-owned organization established in 2005. The current estimate for the completion of the Sellafield cleanup program is approximately 2,220. That is not a typo. The cleanup of Sellafield is expected to take until the year 2120. The cost of the cleanup is currently estimated at approximately £121 billion. That is the current estimate. Previous estimates have been revised upward. The specific challenge of the Sellafield cleanup involves some of the most technically complex nuclear decommissioning work ever attempted. The legacy ponds and silos at Sellafield, which contain radioactive waste accumulated from decades of operation in conditions that were not designed for long-term storage, are among the highest nuclear hazard sites in the world outside the former Soviet Union. The Sellafield cleanup is not a scandal in the conventional sense. It is not being covered up. The Nuclear Decommissioning Authority publishes its plans and its progress and its cost estimates. What it is the full consequence of a decision made in the late 1940s to build a nuclear weapons program in the most expedient location available, without a plan for what would be done with the waste or the contamination when the operations eventually ended. The people who made that decision are all dead. The cleanup they did not plan for is expected to continue for another century. The £121 billion cost is being paid by people who were not born when the decision was made. The Irish Sea, which received the discharges, is still receiving lower-level releases from the ongoing operations and will not be decontaminated by any cleanup program currently planned. The community of Seascale, which has lived adjacent to this site since the 1950s, has been the subject of health studies that have found elevated leukemia rates in children and that have been debated by researchers without reaching a settled conclusion. The site is still operating. The cleanup is still in its early stages. And the question of what Britain's nuclear legacy will mean for the communities and the environment that live with it across the coming century is a question that the £121 billion estimate answers only in financial terms. The full answer is still being written, 1 year at a time, toward 2120.